Afternoon, everybody. Appreciate you coming out today. And I know it's a small group, but we are going to use a microphone because we are streaming over Zoom. So we do have some folks in our Zoom audience and they need the microphone in order to hear me. So I hope it's not too loud for you. But I do appreciate you coming out today to learn more about the general obligation bonds that are going to be on the ballot coming up in just about 4 weeks. Before we get started today, we do want to make some introductions. We have quite a few elected officials and staff members in the room. So I'm Becky Hawk. I'm the town manager, and we'll just go around the room. If you are with the town, if you could just introduce yourself and your role, and I'm going to pass the mic.
Hello, I'm John Higdon, Mayor of Matthews.
If this is working, John Urban, Commissioner Matthews.
Malia Gordon, Assistant Town Manager.
Corey King, Director of the Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Resources Department.
Dana Stuchenke, Transportation Planner for Town of Matthews.
Susan.
Jay Camp, Planning Director.
And I'm Maureen Keith, Communications Coordinator.
So you pretty much have the full gamut with you today. So if we can't answer the question, it may not be able to be answered with this group. But speaking of questions, we do want this to be informative. So if you have a question along the way, please feel free to raise your hand and ask it. And there will also be plenty of opportunity for questions at the end. We also encourage you after the formal part of the presentation today to spend some time at the tables that are there at the room when you first walked in. We've got some drawings of some of the projects that we are envisioning, and we also will have staff there to answer any specific questions about any of the project details that you might have. They kind of hold all of the specifics, so they're a great resource to utilize as we move forward. So a little bit of background about what caused us to even be here today holding a meeting like this. So the town board and staff have been listening to residents over the years, and we've really heard some themes about what we feel like our community is asking for as far as additional things that people might want to see added. It's things like improved connectivity and walkability, more parking in our downtown area, park space and park amenities, as well as additional greenway trails throughout town. And this was culminated in a process a couple years ago where we completed a strategic visioning plan with our town board that had a lot of community input. It resulted in some vision statements of what we think we would like the town to look like as we move closer towards 2040, and starting to move the needle on projects like this is a way to move closer to that vision for Matthews. So as we look at the projects, and some of them are pretty notable in size, we start to look at, well, how do we pull these off? How do we accomplish these projects? Because they do have a significant expense, and we have not been able to move forward with them due to that expense. Right now, these projects lack funding. And so one way that we look to secure funding in order to deliver projects like this is through a general obligation bond process. So it's a long endeavor that requires a vote of our citizens on the November ballot. But this is an opportunity for us to potentially be able to secure funding through this avenue in order to deliver these projects. So on November 8th, which is 4 weeks and a day from today, if you vote, you will see these questions on the ballot. And speaking of the questions, there will be 2 separate questions on the ballot. The first one is going to be, do you as a voter wish to authorize the town to take out up to $21 million in transportation funding? And do you as the voter want to authorize the town to take out up to $14 million in parks and recreation funding? So both of them could be approved, both of them could fail, one could be approved, one could fail. They are separate topics and will be separate votes of the public. So you will notice the language on the ballot. There's some flexibility in how it's written as far as it doesn't name a specific project. It kind of talks about transportation and then some general things about transportation. It talks about parks and recreation and some general things about parks and recreation. It's very intentional. That's actually how we have to write the language. It does create some flexibility for our elected officials to be able to use the funds in the best way possible, but it will have to be transportation related. It will have to be parks and recreation related. The town couldn't decide to build a landfill with these funds. It would have to fit within one of those two categories. But before they even consider doing that, it really comes down to that voter approval first, which will happen on November 8th. So getting into what is a general obligation bond, this is a term that some folks are not familiar with. It's not a financing tool that we use very often in Matthews. And so it is a tool, though, that is available to a local government like Matthews. And it allows us to take on large amounts of debt and spread our payments out over a longer period of time to be able to have a lower annual payment in order to fund larger projects. It does require that voter approval because it does allow us, if we needed to raise taxes in order to pay it back, it does allow us the ability to do that. But again, they are specific, so it has to be transportation related in this case or parks and recreation related. And the other thing to note is these are maximum amounts. So the town board, if it was approved, could never issue any debt. They could issue some of it. They could go up to that maximum amount. They just can't ever go over it. So after the vote, if it is approved, the town board has a number of years to determine when is the best time to move forward. So by statute, you automatically have at least 7 years, and you can also pursue an extension of up to 3 years. So in total, you can have as many as 10 years once that authorization is granted before you move forward. So this again creates some flexibility as far as what's the right time, when would we be ready to construct the projects? Is it the right time in the market? Is it the right time in the community? And so sometimes you may move very, very quickly to issue some or all of the bonds. In other cases, you can actually let that permission expire and you never take out the debt and you never do the projects. And the town has actually done that before. So getting into some of the specifics of the projects that are included in this bond package, these are anticipated projects that the board is intending to build with these funds. The first one is parking improvements in our downtown area. So the plan right now is to add 100 new parking spaces throughout the downtown area. The 48 plus 48 is behind White Duck Taco Shop next to the post office. The town owns a lot back there, so we would be turning that into a parking lot. The 31 spots would be along both North Fremont Street and Library Lane, turning that into a one-way pair. So you have space for parallel parking, a sidewalk, and then you still have through traffic. Adding at least 9 spaces on West Charles Street parallel to the railroad tracks. So next to Temple Mojo, Carolina Beer Temple right now, there's a few spaces that are there along West Charles Street. It would be continuing the parking as you head up towards Fremont Street. Across the railroad tracks on North Fremont Street, where the Windstream is located right now, behind Brakeman's, there's Windstream, and then North Fremont Street is back there. There's, it's actually a wide road that we will be able to turn into 35 spots and have a lot better signage letting folks know that that is there. And then an additional 15 spots on West Matthew Street. This plus 100 plus does account for some anticipated loss of parking along Trade Street between West John Street and West Charles Street as we look to improve some of the sidewalks there that we'll talk about in just a moment. So there would be somewhat of a reduction in parking there, but then looking to more than make up for it within about a block or two of Trade Street. Because this is the proposal of what we are looking to do along Trade Street. So this is looking to widen the sidewalks, create seating areas, have the ability to have patio seating, street trees, and really improve the pedestrian experience right now. It can be very difficult to traverse in some areas. It's quite narrow. You have steps leading into some buildings. If you have any mobility impairments or you're trying to push a stroller or even walk too wide in some places, it's very difficult. And so we have seen this transformation happen in a number of other downtowns, and it has been very successful in taking what we currently have, which is a great downtown. We have a lot of people who frequent it, but looking to make it even better. This is another view. This is on Matthews Mint Hill Road, and you can see the turret of Matthews Station Street in the background. This is re-envisioning the corner. We anticipate that that will be revitalized at some point in the future. That's currently the mobility store. But this is, again, just another view of what that pedestrian experience would look like throughout this corridor. Moving on to another project that is anticipated within the transportation bond category. This is anticipated Greylock Ridge Road extension. And so just to orient you, you've got 485. Let's see if my clicker works here. Maybe. You've got 485 here, and then you've got John Street here. And so this is the Greylock neighborhood. Across the street from there, section AB, this is already funded by the state of North Carolina with zero match. We were able to secure some funding, and so we will be able to deliver that project at no cost to our taxpayers, which we're very excited about. But we are looking for funding for segments C and D that would go from East Charles Street, and we already own the town right of way here, and connect over to future Independence Point Parkway. Just to orient you, Matthews Mint Hill Road is up here and Target is about up there. And so this is looking to create a new crosstown connection so that instead of having to travel into town and take Charles Buckley before you cut all the way back, this would allow you directly to have that access. Future Independence Point Parkway, that portion of it would be funded with private dollars. There's a developer who has control of that property that is looking to build that portion of the road. So this is really kind of the missing middle in order to make that connection happen. Another project in the transportation bond category are sidewalk connections. So if you walk around town, you might be walking and all of a sudden the sidewalk ends, and then a few hundred feet later, it picks up again. And so we have gone out and taken an inventory of all of those gaps and identified the 14 highest priority connections that are less than 500 feet. This is by no means going to fill every sidewalk gap in town, but it's about $3 million worth of projects, the 14 highest priority projects that we've identified that at least starts to move the needle and close some of those gaps. Another project is East Charles Street and Crestdale Road. So if you are familiar with that intersection and you have had to traverse over the railroad tracks, you know that there's a significant elevation change and it is difficult to traverse by car. You see actually the scratch marks on the road are from people bottoming out. Trucks get stuck here with some frequency. And so this would actually be elevating East Charles Street because the railroad, you can't lower the railroad. So we have to raise the road to meet the railroad. And so this would be really elevating the road and creating a much smoother driving experience, much safer. And there's also some drainage issues in the area that this would correct. And finally, a smaller project that would fit within this bond is some matching dollars that we are required to provide to NCDOT at the East John Street and I-485 interchange. They're building a 10-foot wide multi-use path to start to improve the connection in that corridor. And we have to provide some matching dollars. We believe about $500,000 to that project in order to be able to get it completed and for us to give our share. Moving on to the Parks and Recreation bond category, the first major project, and this is about $9 million of the $14 million bond, would be the completion of Purser Halsey Park. So if you're not familiar with this park, as you're traveling on Matthews Mint Hill Road towards Mint Hill, towards the roundabout, This is the park on your right. So there's a dog park that got opened up there about a year and a half ago. And there's a community garden that is there off of Phillips Road as well as some great walking trails. But this is really activating the entire space. That's 93 acres. And this would be adding a significant playground, a splash pad for kids, a clubhouse, amphitheater, fishing pier, and really transforming that space into a very, very active place. Another major project in this category is the Matthews Downtown Loop. So as you go out on multi-use paths, you can go out and back, but often if you're like me, you like to do loops. So you get to see a change of scenery, switch things up a little bit. And so these are some loops that we have been working on completing around downtown. And so a lot of them are built out. You've got 4 Mile Creek Greenway completed. You've got some of the walkways along Trade Street completed, as well as some of the areas out towards the Sportsplex, but we're missing some funding for a few remaining pieces. One of them is along Fullwood Road, being able to turn that into a 10-foot wide multi-use path, an area by Christ Covenant Church, as well as along Lois Lane and John Street as you're heading back into town, so that you would have one continuous loop around downtown on a multi-use path. And finally, park improvements. This is something that we hear from people a lot, where they're interested in seeing better playgrounds, updated equipment, but also bathrooms in more of our parks is one of the #1 things that we hear from residents, that you would like better facilities in our existing parks. And so this is providing some funding for some of those smaller improvements. So we do want to talk about tax implications with this bond. So as we look forward to it being approved, and if all $35 million in bonds were issued, we do anticipate that we would be looking at approximately 3.7 cents per hundred in a tax increase. And so as an example, if a property was assessed at $480,000, that would be a monthly tax increase of approximately $14.83. So a few things about the tax rates. We do understand that interest rates do fluctuate just a little bit, but on a general obligation bond, they do remain lower than the other debt instruments that we have available to us. We do also plan to spread the debt payments out over 20 years. Again, that creates a lower annual payment, so we can fit it into our budget quite a bit easier. And that also allows the cost to be shared, not just by those who live in Matthews now, but people who may continue to move into Matthews over the coming years. So just a little bit more information, again, as an example, looking at the valuations of the homes, because this is based on property tax valuation, the exact value of your property is what would dictate that increase. So if your property is higher than that $480,000 example, you can see it scale up. If the valuation is lower, then you can see that the monthly and annual costs are also lower. So a couple of frequently asked questions. These are questions that have come up as we've been talking to folks and as we've thought through this process. So the first one is, how does GO bond financing, how do those terms compare to standard bank installment financing? Like I mentioned a few slides ago, because the bonds have a 20-year repayment term, we are able to spread that annual payment out over a number of years. And typical installment financing, they're looking for a shorter repayment term, and so you would have a much higher annual payment. We are also in an excellent financial position. We are rated a AA1 community by Moody's. That's the second highest category that you can have. And so that allows us to secure very competitive interest rates when we go to sell the bonds, which makes the GO bond tool a very attractive one for us to consider. The next question is, how is the current market impacting interest rates? So, we've kind of seen the headlines and sort of what's going on with mortgage rates and how does that impact a municipal bond market? And so it does impact it a little bit. So as the Fed raises the rates, there is a small correlation in what happens to these interest rates. But what they look at, and this is the Local Government Commission, which manages and handles all bond issuances for all municipalities in North Carolina. If we want to take on this kind of debt, we must go through the LGC. All towns and counties must go through the local government commission. And so they pointed us to what's called the Bond Buyer 20 Index. And so just as an example, as much as we saw the Fed rates increase a couple of weeks ago, the current rate for municipal bonds was 3.89%. So it's a little bit lower. And then what they added to the conversation was that because of the reputation that North Carolina holds in the national marketplace of being an incredibly well-managed state, thanks to the LGC, and then the town's own strong financial position, we can anticipate that any interest rates that we would get would actually be beating that bond buyers index by approximately 15 to 20 points. So the other question that's come up is, what if the town can't get a 20-year repayment term for the bond? Again, we talked to the LGC about it, and they basically said that they have no concerns unless the entire market were to freeze up. And then I think we all have bigger issues going on. So we do feel very confident that we would be able to spread any payments out over the 20 years. So of course, if this is approved by the voters, the question that we get is, well, how quickly could you start to move? And a lot of factors will come into play with that. So again, we have up to 7 years automatically in order to move on it. So that being said, we know that we are up against rising construction costs, and we know that if these are approved by the voters, that's also a sign that folks want to see these projects. So it will be up to the board to determine the priority of projects and how quickly to move. If the board wanted to move quickly, we could look to be doing a bond issuance as early as 2023 and getting started with construction on at least some of these projects. And can we expect that the list of proposed projects will not change if the bonds get approved? There is flexibility in the language of how this is written. And so it does allow, if say state funding were to come in for one of these projects and it freed up those dollars, the town would have the ability to use the dollars for another transportation related project or another parks and recreation related project. That being said, these are the projects that the town board has identified that they want to make sure get delivered with these funds. So they do always have the final say in the projects that these funds would be used for, but we do anticipate that these would be the projects that we would be focusing on if this is in fact approved. So what questions do any of you have for me or for anybody else in the room? And if we use the microphone here, I think that will come.
Becky, I just wonder, with the town taking on that debt, assuming that passes, is there existing debt that we ought to consider before making that decision?
Sure. So the town has historically been incredibly conservative with taking on any debt. Right now, we only have a single GO bond that we're making payments on. We utilize, I believe it's less than 1% of our total debt capacity. So we have significant room to take on additional debt. We would never get close to taking on that maximum debt capacity, but even with a full issuance of the 35 million, we might go up to maybe 3% of our debt capacity. Maybe that. We have on the installment financing side, we are retiring quite a few. I think 3 different payments are going to be finished this year that will roll off our bill next year. That's frees up over $500,000 a year in annual payments. So kind of bottom line, the amount of debt that we utilize is very, very small. This would increase it a little bit, but it is nowhere close to anything in the maximum capacity that we could take on.
Good.
Which also helps us be the AA1 rated through Moody's because of how we manage our debt. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have any plans on eliminating the 2 or 3 parking spaces on Trade Street by the two gas stations or by the previous two gas stations where people want to turn right and you put that little white plastic thing there?
That gets run over all the time.
Well, I wish it would.
Yeah.
I wish it wasn't
Um,
there.
we haven't designed that project yet, but Susan, I see you nodding your head. Do you want to speak to that project a little bit and some of the anticipated changes on that side of that side of Trade Street?
Certainly, yeah. Thank you for that question. We don't hear a lot of questions about that side of Trade Street. And my answer is going to be just as vague. I think we're going to evaluate all ideas. I'm playing tag with you. We're going to evaluate everything when we go into design phase. We'll definitely evaluate the effectiveness of that right turn lane, right? And those targets that get run over, definitely on both sides of Trade Street in that area, because we don't want to lose too many parking spaces, but we do want to maximize safety with the improvements that we're going to do. Does that help answer the question?
Yes, a little bit, because the line is so long going in that direction into town. Or maybe a sign that says downtown bypass or something and tell them to go around forward to 51.
I like it. I like it.
Any other questions? Any questions on Zoom? Oh, I see a hand raised on Zoom. Mr. Dedman, we are coming to you.
Mr. Dedman, you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question when you're ready.
There we go. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. The last meeting, I asked about if the local merchants had been contacted, and Mayor Higdon spoke up and said that there had been 3 meetings with the local merchants. My understanding is that Mayor Higdon instructed staff to only invite commissioners who were for the bonds. My understanding that's true. And my question is, one, why would you basically censor 2 elected officials who are commissioners from engaging in these meetings? Because technically speaking, when you censor 2 commissioners who've been duly elected, you're actually censoring the very people who elected them.
I'll take that. This is John Higdon, the mayor of Matthews, and I did instruct staff to invite the people that are in favor of the bonds. The majority of our board has spoken. The majority that we voted, we are in favor. The majority is in favor, and we want to see these bonds pass. We certainly have not restricted any information to the other 2 commissioners that are not in favor of the bonds or having it put on the ballot. They've received ample information about the bonds, and they're free to speak their minds about them. So that's my response.
Mayor, if I may, in talking with Mr. Tufano, for example, my understanding is he was unaware of any of these meetings until I asked that question that kind of jarred his memory, that I never heard about these. And since then, from what I understand, both he and Gina Hoover both were not given that information. So it hasn't actually been transferred to these other commissioners. And regardless of what the majority is going for, as voters, taxpayers who have elected these 2 commissioners, I find that unethical, because basically you're loading the bases. And I think they have a right to speak to the merchants as much as the majority does. That's not the way we're supposed to do things in a democratic society. And I'm really surprised and disappointed that that tactic has been used in this. I know you want the bonds badly. That's obvious. But I'm sorry, sir, that's unethical.
Well, I beg to differ, sir. I don't think it's unethical at all. Again, the majority of the board has spoken their mind. I should say also that there was a little bit of confusion, and we erred on the side of being conservative in this way. And that is that we could only have 3 elected members at any of these meetings. Otherwise, it would be considered a public meeting for debate. So we only had 3 people there anyway at any given time. And I will say also that at these meetings, barely a comment was made at all by any elected official. Basically, you saw the same presentation that Becky just gave right now. So I didn't have my pom-poms and cheerleader suit on. I mean, we were there to support Becky, but Becky did 99% of the talking at those meetings.
Chris.
See if this thing's working. I'm past mayor and commissioner, probably the longest serving person on the town for 30 years as mayor and commissioner. And all these projects that I see here are ones that over the years we've talked about and needed to do and have held off on them. So I am supporting the bonds, and I would like to say that I don't know why anybody had problem hearing about it. I've heard about the meeting, so I have attended it when I could. So the actual Matthews, going back a little bit, Matthews is a very conservative town. And when I was mayor in the 70s, we had our very first bond election. And that was a new thing for anybody here, but it showed that we had the backing and the finances to do it. And we've always been very conservative on the side of what amount of bonds we could support. So I reckon the main thing is I do support it because I don't know of any of these that we haven't discussed in the past, and we just haven't pulled the cord to go ahead and get bonds. We've done other things.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
One of the renderings that you showed up there a while ago, it looks like you've eliminated the existing parking in front of Renfro's and the farmer's market down through there. Is that true?
No.
No.
No, we'll go back to that. One more. There we go. So again, let me get the pointer. So this is Stumptown Station. This is Grace O'Malley's right here. So this line right here is meant to show that this would be anticipated to be parallel parking. And so that would not be an elimination, it would be a reorientation. So obviously when you move from angled parking to parallel, there is a reduction in the total number of vehicles that would fit.
Okay.
But there is not any plans to actually fully eliminate parking
And
from
actually,
Trade Street.
it would be a good thing because that angle parking is treacherous.
Depending on the time of day, very
You
true.
can get in there, but you can't get out of there without risking your life or having a flag person behind you to get you out. This would be my flag person.
And really kind of what's driving this that I didn't touch on as much when it was up before is we completed a 2019 mobility study that really demonstrated a lot of the challenges with traversing the area. We don't want to move the buildings. We don't want to touch the buildings. And so if you need to widen the sidewalks, you kind of have one place to go, and that's into the roadway. But designing it, Susan has spoken before about the sensitivity that we understand this area. We understand that people like seeing the parking in front of the buildings, and certainly the business owners want that too. And so we're really trying to strike a balance between making it as walkable as possible, but also making sure that people feel comfortable that they're able to still find the parking that of course they're going to want in the area. Yes, sir.
If all goes well and you get the funding in 2023, which project would you start first, and how long would it take to complete that one and then the rest of them?
Sure. So we feel quite confident that we, under no circumstances, would be issuing all $35 million in bonds at once. Quite frankly, it would overwhelm staff to try to take on that many projects. So if voter approval is gained in November, we would then be looking to engage the board in a prioritization process of how do you want to start? As an example, just the design work for the downtown project, we expect could take 12 months. And so there's a lot of engagement that will need to happen with the business owners and making sure that we kind of cover all of the bases and get it right. And so it's quite possible that we could be fronting design money in order to move that forward, wait until it's designed, and then you're issuing the bond. So you're actually moving as fast as possible on that project, but the end user isn't even going to see construction start for maybe 18 months after. Sure.
Again, I'm just one of 7 on our elected board, but we've heard a lot of our constituents see a great prioritization towards Purser-Halsey and getting that park upfitted. We've had it for a long time. I see Corey kind of nodding a little bit. So I think that's probably going to be at the, one of the top of our list. Again, I'm one of 7, would have to confer with the other commissioners, but that's something, it's a great asset that's really underutilized right now. And a lot of people in town have spoken to me about saying they really wish we could get that going as soon as possible. So I think that's probably one of the ones that I would advocate for, again, being one of 7.
Any other commissioners in the room interested in weighing in on that? No? Okay. All right. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
So that little grassy area that you call by BBT Park, BBT Bank, have you ever thought, sometimes that you hold little concerts there? Not that many people show up. Yeah, right down the street.
It's a little grassy knoll.
On Matthew Station Street?
Mhm.
Oh, so near PNC.
Oh, it's PNC Bank?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Have you thought about naming that? Because I thought of a good name.
Well, the board actually authorized the sale of that lot at their last meeting. So in a few weeks, we will not retain ownership of that parcel. So that is going to be developed as a market hall. So there will be small stalls for kind of startups and, little ice cream shops and things like that that only need a small amount of square footage. And so Brahm Investments is going to be the owner of that property. So, we're still happy to hear the suggestion. We could pass it along, but that's not going to be a grassy lot.
The name I
here
was
for too
thinking
much
was
longer.
Matthew's Backyard.
Yeah. No, that's a good one. So maybe that has application for some other parcel in town.
We have another question from the Zoom audience.
Sure.
Mr. Deming, go ahead when you're ready.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought Purser Park. We're looking at putting $9 million into that park. Do we actually own that land? And I guess my question is, my analogy would be if I had my house and I had a piece of property next to my house that I leased, and I built a garage on that leased property. I don't know that would be a wise choice. And I understand from what I hear that we have a lease contract with Mecklenburg County. But I find it interesting. I just find it hard to believe that Mecklenburg County doesn't have a clause in their lease contract somewhere that if they needed the capital money, that they could sell that property and we would be eligible to purchase it perhaps. But I'm just wondering, is it really wise to put $9 million into a property that we actually don't own?
I can speak to that in generalities, Mr. Dedman, and certainly if any of the elected officials want to weigh in, they're welcome to. So the town has a long-term lease with Mecklenburg County for that property that right now goes through 2057. And there are clauses within the contract that allow us to continue it after that date. Again, presuming both parties are amenable. I don't know that any of us are still going to be involved in local government in 2057. But if the county were to decide that they wanted to sell that, the town has first right of refusal on that property. So we would not be able to have it sold out from underneath us without us having the opportunity to make that purchase. As far as whether or not it's wise, that is for the elected body to decide more than me.
Yeah, the other point is if we did develop it, we would have multiple decades minimum of use of it. And I'm unaware of Mecklenburg County clawing back any park. Corey, are you aware of one? I mean, I've never heard of that happening ever. I mean, they recognize that it's a great amenity for a community. So I think the chances of Mecklenburg County saying, hey, we're going to take that back and build something else on it are minimal. But to Becky's point, it's at least through 2057 we would have it, and then we would have first right of refusal to buy it after that. So I think it'd be fine to go ahead and give our community this amenity for multiple decades between now and 2057.
All right, I don't think I see any additional questions. So we will go ahead and wrap up the formal component of today's session. But again, I just encourage you to spend some time talking to staff and looking at the images that are over at the tables. And certainly if there are any questions that you have of them or me or anyone else in the room, please feel free, and we're happy to hang around for a while. So thank you again for your time. And regardless of how you ultimately vote, we hope you do vote on November 8th. And we want participation more than anything. So thank you very much. Have a good day.